Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of UA Coffee Talk. Today we have a special edition, which is kind of like Ask the Experts, and by experts I mean John Lau and Nebo Radovich. But joining us today is actually Josh from WildCard. And Josh, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your company and your situation?
Yeah. First though, thank you guys so much for taking time to talk to me today. I love the UA Coffee Talk segment. It provides a lot of insightful content that frankly I haven't gotten anywhere else. And just watching it, I remember one of my first big insights was you guys trashing D7 ARPU and D7 ROAS. That was like a big breakthrough in my head. So yeah, it's like actually changing the way that I've been approaching this. So that's really cool. So I'm hoping it's going to be kind of really valuable today. So in terms of like what WildCard is, the business, we are all about reimagining kind of classic card games for mobile. Our audience is older and heavily concentrated in North America, and there is this massive nostalgia factor. So as families grow, these games that they played together as a kid, whether it's Cribbage, gin rummy, spades, things like that, they become harder to play together because the kids are now in different states or different countries, or even just at school. So they're looking to play those games. And we're really competing in the card game vertical, but also against board and word. Our current flagship is Ultimate Cribbage. And what's cool about that, taking a step back, is in the multiplayer card kind of sub-vertical within card, there's melding games like gin rummy, and then there's trick-taking games like spades. And Cribbage is amazing because it's neither of those. So it requires a lot of thinking, and it's just really puzzly and fun. So the reason for this conversation is because we've had some level of success with user acquisition, and predictably, there's a lot of growing pains. We started off just running a couple $100 a day on Facebook because that's super easy. It's really easy for us because we make classic games, so we can do an interest lookalike where it's like people who like Cribbage. And that's super effective. The audience size is like 50K, so that gets used up pretty quick. So we tried to scale and scale and scale and add new platforms. And over time, you really need to be a UA expert. So that's kind of the context behind this conversation.
Great. So in terms of like specific questions, can you kind of help us understand, to the extent that you're able to share some of the data, like what does your kind of, if you can describe what your marketing campaigns kind of looks like today, to the extent that you can share, and then we can dive into like any feedback from Nebo and John about specific issues.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So we're still primarily running on Facebook. We also have a little bit and growing really, really fast on Google, and then just some low-hanging fruit on the SDK networks like Vungle, Unity ads and App11 and stuff like that. Really, the focus though is right now it's still on Facebook. So the way our campaigns are structured is we don't really use any kind of bid caps. We're mostly using just daily spend thresholds, really heavily targeting 1% lookalikes, 1% BB lookalikes, and targeting US, Canada, and a little bit of the UK, but that gets used up pretty quick for us too. Surprisingly, so even though we're about 85 to 90% ad revenue, AEO and VO is working fantastic for us. Even just straight up purchase AEO and VO, it works really well. So the way we're kind of structuring that is we're kind of creating new lists every week and every month, and trying to find new things that work on the audience side. Then on the creative side, we're working with a fantastic agency, Consumer Acquisition. And I mean, I really, in terms of the top performers, to me, it sticks out that them and Bidalgo are the two that are most interesting, that we kind of considered the most heavily. And CA produces about 10 to 12 videos for us a month. And they have a really strong testing process where we start in India with a small budget and just try to screen out the creatives. Then we promote it to Canada. And then if it works, we promote it to the US. So that's our high level strategy. There are definitely some, oh, go ahead.
Oh, and how are you determining your your kind of daily spend today, or your budget? Is that off of a DX RAS target, or how are you?
Yeah. So that's one of the questions I actually have for you guys. So that's gonna be a fun conversation. But the way we're doing it right now is we know that we want to be breaking even between D90 and D120 on our ad spend, not total CAC, just ad spend. And what we've done is we are responsible internally at WildCard for synthesizing a D7 target by OS and media source for that. And then CA is responsible for creating the D1, D3 kind of targets to get to that. We've seen that there are, even within a media source, there can be some changes for us. So like VO matures differently than MAI. So they're responsible for getting to their D7, but we're responsible, if the D7 is wrong, that's on us.
Okay, so just to be clear, with consumer acquisition, you're not just using them for creatives, they're also advising.
Yeah, they're running the UA.
Oh, they are, okay.
Yeah, so they're driving a huge portion of that as well.
Okay. Nemo and John, what do you think? Channels, approach, any thoughts? Initial thoughts?
Yeah, I have a few things that I wanted to share initially. It's like, first of all, I wanted to cover like card games in general. What's good about card games is there's actually organic demand for them. So, there are people who are potentially searching for cribbage, and that's not really the case with a lot of like, especially mid-core to core titles, unless they're kind of big IP or big brands. So I think for games that have like a strong organic demand, it does make sense to like pay special attention to ASO. It does make sense to potentially try preloads and just like, try a super kind of low cost, low quality channels that could work for games that are well known. So think about like Tetris that Network publishes, or I don't know, like you mentioned Gin Rummy and Spades and Solitaire, etc.
Yeah.
I think it's really smart to focus on these like old card games because that ultimately lowers your CAC, and you can be more aggressive on the CPI front. I mean, there are studios like Triple Studios who almost solely focus on these kind of like evergreen games that monetize well enough, and combined with kind of the organic installs, you can turn them into very successful businesses. And one thing that you mentioned, one more thing is that you mentioned just like lookalikes and like refreshing those audiences on a weekly basis. I think for games that do have organic demand, it does make sense to work with interest and the keyword targeting, just because there is an actual interest card games that you can target. So these are kind of like top of the mind things for me. And I wanted to like us to maybe cover like how like VO and AEO and MAI impact games that monetize with ads, because I think that's interesting, and it's in line with like D7 ROS and why it sucks.
Maybe I could ask you a question real quick. So for these other networks, how should Josh be thinking about the amount of budget that he should be spending against those in order for him to definitively determine whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense?
Yeah, it's a little hard to say, because when you like AEO and VO are for lazy people, they do work really well, but it's like it's not really hardcore UA. It's not like really going and like kind of like trolling for whales. It's more like just, hey, look, bring me payers, and that's it. So the thing when your game is ad monetized, it's like the LTV curve of AEO and VO players is significantly different than what's the case for MAI players and rewarded video network players. And then you need to like spend enough money to understand what that LTV curve looks like. And then based on that, you should like invest as much money as you can, as long as it hits your day 90 payback, right? So what's likely happening is that D7 ROS is significantly higher in AEO and VO, right? And then by like day 30, MAI and rewarded video take over, because the cost plays a very important role for ad monetized games. And if your CPI is like $1 on rewarded video and MAI, and it's like $4 on AEO, you kind of have to be very kind of cautious about the CPI, because after 30 days, it's likely that ad monetization takes over, and it grows pretty slowly. It grows steadily, but it takes like 300 days to pay back like $1. Right, so that's what's happening, and paying back like $1 or $3 after 30 days makes a huge difference. So that's kind of like what's happening here. What's likely happening here.
That's a great insight. Thank you. And that's pretty good guesses on your part too.
And Josh, how long has this game been operating?
It's actually been operating for a very long time. So we first launched it all the way back in 2016. It was the first Unity game we ever did. And actually it only started scaling in the last 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
Because of some of the backend technology that we built that allowed us to really run A/B tests kind of nonstop and be measuring our ARPU curve for those A/B tests at an impression level granularity. And we started doing that, and we started hitting these just massive ARPU growth curves. So really, it's been the last 6 months we've been spending on UA heavily for it.
Right, but at least I would say you have a very historical record, right? In terms of data, you can see where you'll have a lot of data against a long-term ARPU curve. And so when you have been coming up with your payback windows to date, how have you been determining that? Is it based upon where you're looking at where it flattens out and you're trying to build in a margin for yourself of a certain percentage, or how have you been thinking about that?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one of the most frustrating things actually about growing ARPU really rapidly. Is so we put a lot of effort into measuring out our curve by country and media source with a lot of variables for about a year out to D180. So that we could measure that. And I started to really start to buy against that aggressively, and it was really helpful. And we had these really different targets for like iOS, US, Google versus Canada, Android, Facebook. And then we started growing, and we started running these A/B tests. And I remember the test we tested dramatically cranking up how many initials we showed. And it was bonkers. What it did was it boosted our day one ARPU by over 100%, and it boosted our D30 when we measured it out by like 40%. And then just a couple months ago, we measured it out to D90, and it's like 20%. And the net effect was that the whole time that we were buying on our historical data, we didn't realize that, oh my gosh, our ARPU curve is fluctuating like crazy. Because frankly, we're resolving a test almost every 2 weeks that has a net 5 to 10% on our D30. And actually, it introduces a lot of uncertainty to the modeling process. So, one of our questions is in real time, say we're running an ARPU test and we've measured a 30-cent measured boost to D30. Is that, a 10% boost to the whole curve, or is it just a 30% boost to the whole curve? Or is it a 30-cent boost to D30 that degrades to a penny or even negative by D90? And maybe that's worth it because it moves the payback period forward. Maybe it doesn't. But it means that it's really hard for us to use historical data when we're small and growing rapidly. If you've been at scale and mature for 6 months or a year, your ARPU data is fantastically valuable. And for us, we can do things like generate lists, but using it to actually create fantastic targets has been more difficult for us. So what we've done instead is take a blended approach where we are trying to look at those old models, but also be constantly projecting forward our most recent D30 data out to our target break even, which is D120, and try to understand where we think the curve is going as opposed to where it is. Definitely easier said than done.
Yeah, and sorry, Josh, you kind of lost me a bit because I'm not as smart as Nebo and John. But so you're seeing a lot of variability in terms of your ARPU curves, and is that based upon like the same targeting, same geos, based upon different
changing the game?
Sorry.
So we're changing the game. So an example would be like if you go from showing interstitials every 8 minutes to every 2 minutes.
I see.
Even if it ends up being net LTV, like that theoretical number positive, it's going to change the shape of your curve because you're going to make more money up front and less long term.
Okay.
So when you're resolving tests like nuts, your curve doesn't stay accurate long enough for you to really be buying on it. If you're netting a 3-5% ARPU gain a month, maybe not. But our targets for monthly growth are 15-20% a month still.
One quick comment I had regarding your earlier question is that looking at some of your user data, your demographic overlaps, heavily with not only card games but like the match 3 puzzle games and a lot of slots as well, right? So that audience traditionally can be relatively expensive, and when you're running a VO and AEO, and to Nibo's point, the upfront cost is incredibly expensive because typically it's more meant for games where there are large purchasers, whales that can come in and really float the entire audience size. Now, my concern with those is that they're never going to be consistent, right? So you could be running VO, it's working great for you, and then for a quarter, and the next quarter, all of a sudden AEO is doing better, despite the fact that VO is supposed to be the premium. With a ad monetized game and potentially even a lower ARPU kind of like payer game, I'm always worried about costs. I'm always worried about that CPI, and you can look at it two ways. Like, if you're basing your performance on paid only, it's going to be very, very, very difficult for you to achieve that payback if a majority of your campaigns are in the VO or AEO bucket because the CPI is just so high. But then you also, and if you're the other way where you're okay with a blended outlook to look at your recoup, it's also very dangerous because you could all of a sudden like have a heavy emphasis of, oh, I need X number of organic in order to achieve a break even within that time. So I do agree a lot with Nibo's strategy of looking closer at how you could utilize interest targeting to help lower down your initial cost. That's one. ASO strategies is definitely a must given that organic traffic. I agree with that because that's the commonality of looking for card games. But when you're testing outside of that, where would you say have been working well for you outside of the Facebook? What has worked really, really well in terms of both scalability and performance outside of Facebook?
That's a great question. So really what's worked great for us in terms of scalability is actually right what you guys are saying. It's those keywords, it's that low cost Google text and Apple search. Those have both been fantastic. We've been able to get good performance in other places, but nowhere near at that scale. And I have one question for you. So you said something about a blended outlook. Could you explain, John, what that means?
Yeah, so some companies are okay taking organic revenue and blended that into your overall growth strategy in order for you to grow a little bit more aggressively. But it can be a slippery slope when you become too heavily dependent on that organic growth in order to achieve whatever like LTV over CAC ratio that you need to maintain. And I'm not a big fan of it because it makes it seem like your UA or your overall growth strategy is doing better than it is. But then I think even if you're going to go down that path, it's important for you to really focus on paid only performance and see how that is actually evolving over time.
John, we lost your video, by the way. If you can.
Yeah, I went to the kitchen to get coffee.
Okay.
I got my coffee as well, so it's a proper UA coffee.
So one question for you two is, so one thing that we've seen that was really, really interesting is, you kind of take a step back first. So we use Mopub for mediation, and they have an impression level ad revenue reporting tool. It's fantastic. And then in our mediation kind of waterfall, we run programmatic too, but in our mediation waterfall, the line item floors for, let's say, interstitial might range from $2 up to like 120. And one thing that we saw when we switched from kind of average CPM reporting to actually reporting the impression level and seeing when there's like 120 CPM ad fee versus a $2, the VO and the AEO campaigns exploded, especially on Facebook. Because what Facebook is saying with those AEO and VO bids is, hey, we know that user and we know they're worth a lot. So when they're in our game and we're requesting fan for an impression, they're willing to pay up pretty high for it. So I'm kind of curious to know if you're aware of that effect and if that still, you still feel that AEO and VO is kind of scary for primarily ad-based games.
Yeah, I actually wanted to piggyback on like John's point and talk about it. I mean, like to your like previous question, probably from 10 minutes ago. I mean, I would model out ad revenue, ad LTV curve, and like IP LTV curve differently, because what happened is when you started doing AEO and VO, your like ad CPM skyrocketed because of AEO and VO. So what you really need to do is basically you need to have user level ad revenue to understand what's the value of each user and what's the overall impact on like returns, really, not necessarily just campaigns, because AEO and VO can help you monetize the existing users better and by like improving the ad CPMs. However, like that strategy is only it's a little tricky because they tend to cherry pick, so they don't really pay $120 for like 10% of your impressions, but probably for like 1 to 2%. So you kind of need to, that's why you need different LTV curves to understand what's going on. And then like based on those two, you can make the decision on where to invest money. So maybe like AEO and VO bring you like $120 impressions, but the overall impact or the incremental revenue you get from those is not like high enough to kind of offset the cost. So that's something you need to be aware of. But definitely having user level ad revenue is crucial, and having like a header bidding partner like Mopub or AppLovin or IronSource is important, because then you'll be able to understand that better. And the last thing, one thing you might like learn over time is that low CPI, low cost campaigns might still do better because the average CPM is kind of like higher than what it was before. And the risk profile is much better because like your CPI is lower, and then you can pay the money back sooner. So the reason why John mentioned what he mentioned about like the high cost of AEO VO is that you end up feeling like very comfortable because your ad CPMs look good, and then suddenly your like CPI moves from $4 to $6, and you're pretty much fucked because your like long-term retention is not that good, and the last $2 take like 2,000 days to pay back. So
no, that's exactly right.
Yeah, it's so Dan, the CEO of Network, like he has this saying, like whenever if someone gave me $1 every time someone said like, hey, we started spending more on VO and the cost is going up, he would probably be a millionaire, because like VO can be very dangerous if you don't manage the cost properly.
No, that's exactly right. Especially when you have a ad monetized game, like your LTV, it is probably a long time, significantly longer than, let's say, if you're looking at like someone who does mid-core, for example, right? So you really want that person to stay in your game as long as possible to generate those like 2 to 15 cents ARPU on a daily basis. And unfortunately, that can also fluctuate, right? Like depending on your country, depending on your user segments or where you're putting your ad, your ARPU on ad revenue can be inconsistent. You have competition, you have seasonality, you have a lot of different things that can impact that. So all of that will bake into, I'm assuming, why you're seeing a lot of fluctuation. And if you throw a wrench like VO costs skyrocketing or dropping like on top of what is already very relatively volatile, I think is going to be very, very difficult to manage. I'm not saying that ad revenue or app-based games are always very, very volatile, but I think there's a lot of things that can impact. Like I really like what you said earlier about changing an interstitial every 2 minutes to 8 minutes, and or from 8 minutes to every 2 minutes, how that impacts not only your upfront revenue, but potentially the lifetime of that user. So I'm actually very, very impressed that you guys are thinking about these things.
Awesome. Well, thanks. And actually, I feel like I'm learning a lot right now. I think my big takeaway, if I'm kind of getting this correctly, is there is definitely a hidden risk to the AEO and the VO campaigns. And we should be looking at that, how they age out compared to MAI very carefully. That is frankly something we're not doing right now. So that's, honestly, you've given me my tasking for today.
Yeah. I mean, I would just
do that now.
Yeah, basically the graph I shared in that D7 ROS article is explaining that. I mean, I can share it real quick if you guys want to, just so you can see what it looks like. But it's, with AEO and VO, because they know players much better, like the LTV curve looks significantly different. And then the early data looks great. While with, MAI and potentially lower cost CPI channels, you might be able to achieve better results just because the cost is lower. And then, over like 60 to 90 days, the things will look significantly different. Let me just load up the graph so I can brag about it.
I guess while Nibo's pulling that up, I think that really big emphasis we have is really diversify. When you're scaling up, to the level you're scaling up today, and the reliance on AEO and VO to drive your business becomes a very, very risky proposition. And I have no good answer as like, what are the good channels for you to diversify into? You have to test, and it's very, very game specific. But I can give you an example, right? At Play Studios, at one point, our spend on, our reliance on AEO, this is before VO, was roughly about 70% of our budget plus, right? And at one point, we looked at the entire portfolio and we're like, oh, wow, we can't, if anything were to happen, well, things are doing really, really well, but if anything bad were to happen, it could completely tank our entire marketing portfolio. And from that point, we made a marked effort to reduce our reliance on not only the AEO campaigns, but on Facebook overall, so that we can leverage other channels, because we know fundamentally you can get that user in the ecosystem from a different medium. It is much more difficult, and to Nibo's point, it takes a lot more work, but they are out there and you can find them. And yes, initially when you're growing, you can rely super heavily on Facebook because it is, the requirement for entry is relatively easy, right? But as you mature, not only as a company, but as a growth marketer, you have to move out of that space. If you want to go kind of move forward into the next level, is look at other channels where it will require a lot more manual work and thinking around how you want to strategize your campaign optimization.
And when we're talking here about AEO and VO, we're mostly talking about AEO for purchase. Like you could, like basically, your focus should be on controlling the CPI and making sure it doesn't like skyrocket. So you could easily do like AEO for ad view, for example, or for like a certain engagement event that could work really well. I'm gonna share my screen real quick, just so you can see the graphs. So like basically it's these two graphs. So with VO and AEO, what happens is like your early revenue looks really good and then things flatten out. I mean, it could be that also your game is not optimized for IP. And then when you're like solely relying on IP, first 10, 15 days look really good. But then when there's like less content and then when people just stop spending, what happens is this LTV curve flattens. But like early 7 days, like first 7 days or first 14 days look pretty good. And like the LTV is growing pretty aggressively. But at the same time, you're kind of paying a pretty high cost for that. While with kind of like lower CPI strategy, like for traffic that's solely ad monetized, the LTV growth is much slower. But because of the lower cost as well, you might actually pay the money back sooner than what's the case with like VO and AEO, because the cost is lower and then the CPI is fully paid back by ads. So that's something just to like have in mind. And that's why I think it's important to have ad LTV curve and IP LTV curves separate to understand what's the impact of each one of those on payback. And then by campaign, by like optimization model, like mobile app install, AEO, VO, AEO for view it, or rewarded video, et cetera, rewarded video network. So I'm talking too much. I'm going to stop sharing my
Josh, one thought
that was fascinating. Sorry, Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, just kind of thinking out loud, but because you have a lot of historical data, and if your ARPU curves are jumping around, one thing you might want to consider, and again, John, you would check me if I'm wrong on this, is like maybe what you should be also doing is checking your scale of spend against your ROAS target. So like, for example, if you were to evaluate what your D7 ROAS against your daily spend is, sometimes what we see is we'll see like a knee bend at a certain point of spend sometimes for some games. But if you're unsure about spend, you might want to just sit below the bend.
That's good. I hadn't even considered that.
Okay,
that's a good idea. Awesome.
Maybe in terms of like more at the executional level, because I do think we've got unlike me, we've got practitioners actually executing stuff. John and Ivo, do you guys have any thoughts in terms of like the ad format mix or creative types or things like that? Or maybe Josh, you can tell us how you're approaching that, and then you can get some actual practitioner level advice.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. So one of the big questions that I have is creative type. Statics are just crushing it for us right now. I think we're at about 75% static in terms of spend. But we're investing almost all of our effort into video production, under the hypothesis that when we find a video winner, it will outperform the best static. We've invested a couple months in that strategy now, and we're getting close, but we haven't really passed the performance yet. So I'm kind of curious to understand from you all, especially on Facebook, is that a valid path? Or is there a point when you say, like, this, screw it, we're leaning in on statics, even though it's not what's supposed to work the best?
Well, how come you think, and this is not critical, it's very, very curious, how come you think that video would outperform static?
That's a good question. Frankly, I don't think I have a great answer for that. What we've seen over long periods of time is that videos tend to go stale a little bit slower, but I don't have any solid evidence that videos are going to outperform universally. I guess that was just my assumption, to be honest.
So the reason why I asked that is because I don't know, and this could be very game specific, but I'm not convinced that like one format will drive better ROAS, for example, than another format necessarily, or bring you a better user than another user. What I think will change is the lifetime of the creative. So a good video might last longer, to your point, than statics, but at the same time, you could probably knock out statics significantly faster than video. So I think if statics are working for you and they're working really, really well, I wouldn't worry too much about looking for that one video winner that's gonna somehow be a game changer, but more focus on diversifying your creative mix so that you can elongate the lifetime of your overall creatives, right? So Nebo wrote an incredible Medium article about maintaining healthy IPMs and stuff like that. So I think if it were me, my focus would be about how can I maintain a higher average IPM of my overall creative mix rather than like one or two creatives that's going to be a winner. Because like if you're chasing hits, it's tough to know what's going to be a hit, what's not, and then I've had experience where things were a hit. Actually, Consumer Acquisition was the one who made the video that made the hit that did really, really well for us at Play Studios. And when we first looked at it, we thought this is not going to work at all. It became a hit for a year, our best performing creative for a year, right? So my point is you just don't know. So instead of focusing, oh, let me just crank out a lot of videos and hope one of them is a winner, focus on just whatever your average IPM is across your entire portfolio mix, making sure that you're maintaining that more consistently. I think that consistency is more important than one or two hits that's going to somehow change the game for like a week, and then everything kind of comes back down.
All right, that's awesome feedback because you totally changed my perspective on it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, my stance on this is that I think statics will only take you so far. I think there's some limit because like most of the big advertisers are not really running statics or not at scale. And because you're spending now, like you're not spending like millions of dollars a month, you can do that. But once you start spending more money, you kind of have to fire from all weapons. And then video needs to be part of your creative mix. And you'll have to invest more in that particular ad unit. I think good thing about statics at this scale is that they're easy to kind of produce and like it's pretty quick. But you know, over time, like as you start spending more, you'll have to create video and like video ads and multiple dimensions of video ads to test like rewarded video specific sizes, you know, newsfeed specific sizes, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're now kind of, because of the scale, you can afford to just focus on statics and things are working well. Also, one thing that's interesting, we didn't talk much about it, but I did read the presentation you shared. Like the audience that's playing these games is slightly older. And I think because of that, they're kind of more responsive to ads than was the case. And when I say older, it's like 45 to 50 plus. And they're more responsive to ads in general than, you know, like 15 to 25 audience that doesn't really look at any content anymore, just scrolls impulsively. So I think that's one reason why statics are working. It's because like the audience that you're going after is slightly more responsive to statics than what's the case with potential younger players. And maybe, yeah.
Oh, I was gonna add like from a video perspective, one thing that has been helpful for me in the past, and it's something even today I'm still asking my creative team to do, is focus more on potentially creating what I call micro videos, right? So if you and I actually stole this idea from Nebo in his article a while back. And so what I do now is, instead of like telling my creative or motion graphic artists to say, hey, give me a 15-second video, we actually shoot or create like multiple 3 to 5 second videos, and then from that I create like 15 different iterations of it. And of course they have their different concepts, they focus on different things, and then they focus on different, either focus on the product feature. Some of them might focus on like the game itself, why it's fun. You might focus on like, hey, there's a group play, you know. So from that aspect, you could actually do a very little like actual video production on set, but have a lot more value in what you create that can help you create a lot of different combinations to run for a decent amount of time.
Interesting. So when you make those, it sounds like those are unique creatives you're making. They're not just like cut up longer videos. They're brand new content.
Can you clarify, what do you mean by cut up?
They're kind of both. They're new content, but the same concepts.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. Like right now I work for e-commerce grocery business, right? So one thing that we're doing is we might have some shots on like a certain merchandise or certain product, right? And I could have one video that is really just focused on that single product for 15 seconds. But then I can, because there are a bunch of 4 to 5 second shots of multiple different products, I can then mix and match and create a lot of different iterations, whether it is I want a 15-second video that focuses on dessert, or I want a video that focuses on both entree and dessert, or a bunch of different videos that focus on snacks and dessert, right? So that combination gives me the ability to create a lot of different video, not just concept. The concept could be the focus of what merchandise category we're targeting, but at the same time, it gives my creative team a lot less pressure of constantly having to come up with a fresh video or fresh concept. And that way, when we're looking at our creative sprints, it's a lot easier for them to knock out assets for me on a monthly or weekly basis, so that I can then continue to refresh them on my campaigns.
Josh, do you have any sort of, in terms of like outstanding questions, or have we addressed some of the, and when I say we, I mean more John and Nebo, but have we addressed some of the bigger questions, or is there more, should we go deeper into a specific area to try and address something, or if there are any other outstanding issues, should we tackle those?
Yeah, there are some other questions I'd love to cover. I think we absolutely crushed the creative type question. I'm kind of quiet 'cause I'm just thinking all these different things I could be doing now. It's hard for me not to start like writing up a plan. But kind of, we already sort of touched on this, but one big question is, as you scale through that, let's say 100 to $250,000 monthly spend range, what are the strategies that tend to stop working or things that tend to start working? So some of the things I've already heard from you guys is like statics tend to stop working and stop allowing you to scale. And the AEO and VO performance may fall off a cliff or just become dangerous at that scale if it's a high percentage of your spend. Are there any other things that stop or start working?
Yeah, I think with scale, like the number one thing is to be very cautious about the cost. I mean, AEO and VO might continue to work, just like your RI will probably go down because of the cost. So make sure that you're always, tracking the cost and making sure that it's not growing like exponentially. The good thing about scaling is that you'll have more information. So like you'll understand better which placements are working for you, whether it's like audience network or news feed or messenger. Probably not, but you just have more data that will help you make kind of more better decisions and potentially try kind of more granular targeting. So that's a good thing of scaling. When you're scaling, especially because your game is kind of it's not like a global phenomenon. It seems like it's known in like a few geos. You should kind of identify those geos and potentially group things together to kind of maintain the cost, group countries together to maintain the cost and make it easier for Facebook to learn. I think what's happening in a lot of cases when companies scale their campaigns, they just create a ton of campaigns that end up stuck in the learning phase. And then as a result of that, your ROI goes down and the cost goes up. So it's potentially better to kind of group countries together and make it easier for Facebook to learn and hit your goals sooner. And yeah, like the last thing is that your creative production, you need to scale your creative production as well. So you need to make sure that creative fatigue is not like a big problem and that you have like a healthy influx of new creative every week or month at the minimum.
It might even be worthwhile to just group countries outside the U.S. At least group countries outside U.S. Except for like Canada, for example, into worldwide campaigns, just so that you have that kind of minimum criteria of scale to go through the learning process. As you're scaling up your budget, one thing that I've actually run into this situation before, but stand firm on your payback. Stand firm on. Because it gets easy for you to tell yourself, it's like, well, I'm making this much revenue. Maybe we shift from like 90 days to 120 days. Maybe we shift from 120 days to beyond. Stand firm on that because you have to measure it apples to apples when you're spending either 100K to 200K or maybe 500K a month. So that's one thing. I did take a look at one of your questions about user lists. And of course, like IDFA deprecation, I shouldn't say IDFA deprecation. It's more user opt-out is more the more accurate statement. But I would be interesting to see how that impacts your programmatic campaigns because a lot of the programmatic algorithm is based on optimizing on the device ID level, or the ad ID level. So I'm not sure how that would impact. Granted, please understand that no one has a good answer of how this is going to impact. I think like Nebo and I are both kind of sitting and waiting to see how things will be impacted in the next couple of months. But we know several things. We know that Facebook will likely be less impacted because Facebook has a lot of other means of identifying users across platforms, across their properties. And so as long as you're collecting things like email or user information, you could continue to feed that into Facebook to manage your Facebook campaigns. But programmatic, they don't really have that, and I don't know the match rate of emails in programmatic. I don't think it's going to be as high as Facebook, for example. So it'd be interesting to see how those campaigns change over time.
Yeah, I also think it might have a negative impact on ad monetization because Facebook won't be able to cherry pick impressions anymore, assuming that they don't know who the users are. That's something I'm researching right now. I don't still fully understand the impact, but like just be aware of that. A potential good thing is that the CPIs might go down as a result of that because CPMs will go down. But it's good to have kind of healthy ad monetization as well, just to make sure that you're not super dependent on Facebook and Google once the IDFA is gone.
Yeah, I've got a question actually just related to being stuck in learning phase. So if there are a lot of product level changes, in the product, which seems like that's the case for this game, does that, I mean, certainly on the campaign side, if you make changes that can, get you back into learning phase, but on the product level, if you make big, potentially like 30% change in ARPU curve or things like that, does that get you back into learning phase as well?
Changes on the product side, I mean, not really. I mean, because what really gets you out of the or gets you back in the learning phase is if you change something significantly on the campaign side, like change the budget like for more than like 30%, or like CPA, whatever your kind of target cost is. It could help campaigns learn faster if you, for example, front-loaded more purchases. Like, if most of the purchases happen in the first day or in the first 7 days, that would help Facebook and Google learn faster. So that's something we tested, and it worked in some cases, it didn't work in some cases, and it could potentially hurt you down the road if you're too aggressive with monetization early. So my recommendation is just to A/B test and see what's going to happen, because no one really has the right answer to that, and Facebook keeps changing things all the time.
I would say the opposite, interestingly, can be true though. So I've had examples where, especially running pricing tests on early IAPs and stuff like that, if you're skewing really hard towards AEO and VO, it can actually skew your results towards the more expensive and kind of things like that win. Then perhaps when you even out your ad spend, it actually wouldn't have won. It's another vote for multi-arm bandit stuff, I suppose. But go ahead.
Sorry, I wonder if there's a difference in terms of like how Facebook targets AEO and VO audiences, right? So there's a fundamental difference, because if you think about it, e-commerce is probably buying AEO and VO along with gaming. And with e-commerce, you're looking for buyers who pay within the first 3 days, and they pay a lot. And then so the purchases are, from a gaming kind of like perspective, you're essentially buying a bunch of whales that's consistently buying on a weekly or like bi-monthly basis. Whereas if you flip it on the other side, and you're looking for people who, let's say, the purchases is heavier on the tail end of that 7-day look back window, you might really be looking for a different user. So you might not be competing directly, even though it's still VO and AEO and still competing within the purchaser pool, but the purchasing behavior within that pool, you might be able to carve out a different audience that you can target. Of course, you can't manually and you can't quantitatively know that, but I'm just curious, like, is there any difference between even within the payer pool of the VO or AO audience, there is going to be different kind of opportunities for you to play around with where you go hard on your pricing or where you want to really get that user to monetize. Because a lot of people want to front load purchases. And if you went the other way around, well, the Facebook algorithm look for fundamentally a different user for you.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question. It's one of the things that, as we're looking to integrate sometime soon, which is Unity Ads kind of map feature, it's something that we're kind of thinking about. What we have seen, and so far we don't have a great kind of definitive answer yet, but it definitely seems like the AEO campaigns, especially AEO purchase, tend to have a lot of people that make one purchase and it's just like remove ads. Whereas, so it's like $3 and it's great, but it's whatever. Whereas VO are more likely to actually buy the currencies, which bodes well, obviously. So that's one thing that we're starting to look into a little bit, but frankly, we aren't very sophisticated there yet.
Okay. Well, I think in the interest of time, is there any last question or comments from you, John and Ebo?
I think for me is that just looking at your presentation and your write-up and the way you're thinking about this, you're already incredibly sophisticated in terms of how you're approaching this. So there's that. I know a lot of companies in my peer group that aren't even thinking about some of the things that you're thinking about. So I'm incredibly impressed by how you're even approaching this. And I think this is really going to be a springboard to how you can think about growth for a very much longer period of time. So we're talking about the next 5 years, and keep at it. And I think from a creative perspective, Nebo and I are in love with creative because we really feel like that's fundamentally the biggest lever you can pull. So play around with that and don't fall in love with your ideas. I think that's the biggest advice with the creatives, never fall in love with your own ideas or what you think or your own hypothesis. Really just test different things, even things that you don't think will work, test it and let the data speak. And that's probably my biggest advice I can give today.
Yeah, same here. I mean, also it's worth mentioning they're just a 2-person company, right? So great job, guys. I mean, everything that John said, when it comes to creative, just trust the process, believe in the process, not in a specific tactic. And yeah, my number one recommendation is, just look at ad revenue and the IP revenue separately, understand what's the impact of those on UA campaigns, and that will probably unlock a lot of new growth opportunities for you guys. So I got to run. It was great talking to you guys.
Right.
And, it's good being on another UA coffee talk.
Yeah,
Bye,
awesome.
Paul.
Thank you guys so much for the kind words.
Hey,
Bye,
no
Paul.
problem.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.